Hi, welcome to Windows Instant Recovery and Bare Metal Recovery for the Unitrends Certified System Administration course. By the end of this module, you'll be able to describe how Windows agent-based instant recovery works for physical and virtual Unitrends appliances. You'll also be able to set up Windows Instant Recovery before a client fails. You'll also perform Windows Instant Recovery, WinIR, and you'll perform integrated bare metal recovery, or a BMR. First, let's take a look at an overview and really how Windows Instant Recovery works. We're going to focus on Windows Instant Recovery first. Windows Instant Recovery, or WinIR, really provides instant recovery of Windows agent-based assets. And when I mean instant recovery, you have to pre-plan for this. Right? It requires a master file level backup at least, and you're usually going to schedule, incrementals. You're going to set up a virtual failover client ahead of time, usually only on your critical assets. Now, when you set these up, we're going to take all the backups and we'll restore those into the VFC so it stays current. And once this machine is up to date and current, you can fail it over either into live or audit modes. We're going to show you that once again in the demo piece too. How Windows Instant Recovery works, a couple of different approaches here. So we're going to show you the virtual appliance and the recovery series together, right? On both the UB and the recovery series, you can do WinIR in this fashion. So if you first take a look at our physical server, we're going to once again schedule agent-based backup against those, so we have recovery points that are kept up to date on the Unitrends appliance, whether it's physical or virtual. And once again, we do have to carve out instant recovery storage space, so we pre-plan. We add up the total number of clients, how big are those, give it some room to grow, and we can put in our VFC candidates. Right? So we point a machine over to VMware, right? We point it over to VMware, and it uses processor memory from VMware and storage on VMware to recreate the machine and keep it up to date through the agent. So it keeps that machine up to date offline along with all your other VMware guests. So it keeps that machine up to date through the agent-based process with all the other VM guests. Okay, now, if you have a recovery series appliance only, or you be running on your own version of Linux now, too, you kind of get an added bonus. Okay, you can still, once again, schedule your agent-based backups, but usually you're going to carve out a little bit more instant recovery storage because they're not going to be hosted on VMware. You're going to host these things right off of your appliance itself. Right, the storage, the processor, the memory, it comes off the recovery series appliance. So if you lose your server, you can fail it over right on the server itself. Right, and then if you have to fail back, then you go ahead and create your additional server. Get new hardware, whatever you're going to do. You boot that off of the ISO CD. Right, this is real similar to the integrated bare metal process, the BMR here. You go back to your latest recovery point. You do your own integrated bare metal. You run one more incremental against your live asset running off the Unitrends appliance to get it all the way up to date. Then you shut it down. Then you restore through the agent your latest recovery point, and you make your new server the live server. Right? There's a recovery failback process that you have to go through here. Right? But it's running temporarily off the Unitrends appliance, which is what's really cool about this process. Instant recovery for pre-planned virtual failover clients. Setting up Windows Instant Recovery, right? You want to do this once again before the client fails. There are a few requirements I want to go over with you. Once again, make sure you're maintaining backups. If it's a physical server or even a virtual asset that you're using the agent on, you're going to schedule backups against it, usually, every 24 hours at least, a once-a-day incremental. Could be forever. Ensure that you have protected the Windows server with the latest available release on the agent. Make sure you're always running the newest version of our agent. That's always a best practice. Next one down there is the VFC, the virtual failover client. Make sure you create that thing in advance. You can do it if it dies after the fact and the only hardware you got around is your appliance. You can point it to the appliance. It just takes time to create it. If you're okay with that downtime, you can create them after the fact. But to work best for instant recovery, it needs to be created in advance. All right, so you're gonna make sure you point your machines to the resources so that when the live machine fails, you're ready to restore this thing instantly. That's the whole point of instant recovery. Now, when you go in live mode, that virtual failover client, it replaces the original Windows asset until you can perform a bare metal recovery back once again. You can fail back to some sort of new physical hardware. And then you may still have to recover data, by the way. You have the ability in Windows Instant Recovery to mark certain databases for SQL and Exchange through the agents. So if you're backing up file level backups, you're also backing up databases through the agents. When you set up your instant recovery for SQL and Exchange, pay attention because you can also select databases. And those databases, every time we back up those database assets, they will turn around and restore those database or those application backups into that VFC as well, keeping the applications up to date. Once again, only for SQL and Exchange. All right, but for some servers, even when you do a bare metal recovery, we're going to talk about it later, you may have to restore your databases back on top, and Windows Instant Recovery does this for you as part of SQL and Exchange. It's pretty cool. Let's take a high-level overview of setting up a virtual failover client. Right, biggest thing you're going to do, once again, is go back through your cattle, pets, and people, and really only the people type of assets are going to be your VFCs. So determine, where the virtual failover client is going to reside based on your appliance type. Once again, if you have a virtual appliance, you're kind of limited. You can only go to your hypervisor platforms you're tied to, back to VMware, back to Hyper-V. Any agent-based backup, you can create the VFC through their platform. Once again, check out the demo. I'm going to show you examples of it in both Hyper-V and VMware today. Before you submit any job, make sure you allocate the system storage for instant recovery. It will fail immediately if you don't allocate enough instant recovery storage to your appliance. I'm going to show you how to do that once again in the demo as well too. Make sure you have instant recovery storage space allocated. You're also going to make sure you set up a virtual bridge network and the network access to the LAN during instant recovery so you can do live mode. If you don't enable that bridge, your live mode's not going to work through there. You'll only be able to get to them through the VNC viewer or the VMware console or Hyper-V consoles. Then when you get all this figured out, you're ready to go ahead and submit and create your virtual failover client with all of these settings. Once again, I'm going to show you how these settings work inside of the demo piece. It's just kind of a high-level overview of things to think about before you kind of set up a VFC. Now, when you think about determining where it's going to reside, once again, you got those different options. I went over the quick list earlier. Let's get down into them a little bit deeper now. Once again, you've got the Unitrends appliance, and you can do Windows Instant Recovery on a local backup appliance itself and a backup copy target appliance too. So you can take hot backup copies and turn those into Windows Instant Recovery off of a target. It's pretty cool. All right, when we look at ESXi hosts, going to VMware, we support versions ESXi 5.1, 5.5, and 6.0. If you're creating a VFC with larger than 2 terabytes, you definitely want to make sure you're on 5.5 VMware or higher. And with Hyper-V, we support Windows Server 2008 R2 or higher with Hyper-V role enabled. And then, of course, we also support Hyper-V servers 2008 or higher as well, too. Your VFCs they must support pass-through disks. right? It's basically what we're creating is our own virtual disk underneath there. Now, Hyper-V clusters, we're going to break that down a little bit different for you here on the next slide because there's some additional caveats we want to cover. Now, once the VFC is configured, you can't make any changes. Any alterations, changing the IP, things like that, will cause it to halt and fail, become into an inconsistent state. All right, it says halted right in there. If you modify the IP address on the backside or something like that, and the client can't reach it on the original address we think it's running, it's going to fail it. It's the most common reason. You have to tear it down and recreate it brand new if you want to change any configuration. Now, the additional considerations for clustered Hyper-V, once again, you want to make sure you install the agent on every node in your cluster. If you think back to the Hyper-V backups, same rule of thumb. You must add each node to the appliance so that way we can see all the nodes we want to do instant recovery to, by the way. And when you select the location for the VFC, you want to make sure you select the cluster. Right? You can't specify an owner node. You have to go to the cluster, right? And then from there, you'll see your configuration underneath it. Right? And select the network switch, too, that's common to all nodes in the cluster. That way you can move them around. Right? If you don't select this switch that's common, you go into live mode, and it's going to lose connection if it goes to another cluster. Right, you lose that connectivity. For VFCs running on 2008 server R2 in cluster configuration, you want to make sure you enable the DCOM and the WMI virtualization access for all those nodes in that cluster too. There's a KB article 1140 out there for you for more information on that. But if you're still running 2008 R2, there's some additional DCOM and WMI virtualization you need to enable access for. Make sure that's on all those clusters. And then during a live migration of a clustered VFC, the Unitrends appliance cannot restore it or verify it in the audit mode or boot it into live mode. During the live migration of a clustered failover client, the Unitrends appliance can't restore to the VFC while it's in live mode. Right? You can't go back and audit them. And once it's booted into live mode, it's there. You have to tear it down and be ready for your failover back, right? That's really similar to all the other ones too. When we take a little bit deeper dive into allocating the system storage for instant recovery, remember I gave you a skinny of it earlier, adding up your clients and all that. Let's take a deeper look at this for you. Because once again, it's your backup system or the replication target. So you can allocate this storage on both appliances. Make sure you do. And this storage, it is part of your backup storage. And part of the same hot backup storage. So it's going to take retention away. All right. It allows you to, by allocating the storage, it allows you to slice some apart for instant recovery. Now, once you allocate resources towards instant recovery and you put a virtual failover client in that instant recovery and it starts to use that space, that storage, it can't be used for anything else. It's taken away from backups and archives and deduplication, all that stuff. So before you do allocate any storage, make sure you're looking at your system load and utilization and the storage used on it so far kind of per asset. Can you afford to lose retention by increasing your instant recovery storage space and utilizing it? Now, when we talk about Windows Instant Recovery through the agent, you must allocate at least 25% above the amount of total used space for all the assets combined. That's the skinny I gave you earlier, is if you have two servers, they're 100 gigs each used, then you better add in about 150 gigs in there, give them some room to grow. Now, you can do that math all the way up the chain depending on how big your servers are. Add all of them up. You got 3 at 50 gigs each, 150 gigs plus 25%. Do the math. 3 at 100 each, 300 plus 25%. Now, when you talk about setting up that virtual bridge network, you want to make sure you assign the virtual bridge network to the physical Ethernet adapter. Usually you're ETH0 in there, but you can go to ETH1 and set up a different private network, if you want to go that more advanced. It is needed for live mode. To go live mode instant recovery, you need to set this bridge up or it's just not going to go live. We can't go through that network configuration process. Now, to maintain the virtual bridge network, it still is in the legacy UI. I will show it to you in the legacy UI in the demo portion. All right, when you create a VFC, you're going to determine some parameters. Once again, we talked about this a little bit before. When you're pointed to VMware and Hyper-V, right, take a look at which host you want it to go on. Right, check your volumes, your resource pools. All right, check where you're going to put your virtual disks. You get to choose all this storage. All right, you get to choose all these options. Which network settings are you use? Which network configuration? All right, you put in the IP addresses that you're going to actually use to boot the VFCs off of running the Unitrends agent in here. All right, it's pretty cool. You can even tell it you don't want to keep certain drives up to date. All right, and then if you have, once again, any kind of SQL or Exchange that you want to point, you can do that too. WinIR best practices in here. Once again, you want to maintain those agent-level backups on a physical server asset. You want to create your virtual client ahead of time before there's a system failure. You can do it after the fact. You just have to realize that it takes Unitrends time to create the machine, to perform the restores over there, to build it, to get it up to date before you can start to power it on. It truly helps to have these created in advance ahead of time. Now, there are some backup recommendations. We do recommend, as I mentioned earlier, incremental forever. Just a once-a-day snapshot is all you really need to keep Windows Instant Recovery up to date from the OS perspective. For SQL Server application backups, you want to make sure you're using SQL fulls and transaction logs. For Exchange, you can use full and incremental backups. Much easier to restore and keep up to date within the offline virtual failover client. The last piece there, probably the most important piece, you do want to make sure you audit these virtual failover clients periodically. Make sure you verify that these things are booting up successfully. There are options in the interface to enable reporting. If you point it to the physical appliances on our recovery series, you create a failover client pointed to the physical appliances or Hyper-V. You can set it to send you the reports. VMware, we don't allow you to do that for some reason. We'll show you that in the demo once again. But make sure you're auditing those. When we take a look at the audit mode process for Windows Instant Recovery, once again, audit them periodically. And after you set this thing up, once a month, once a quarter, whatever you set up, create a calendar event, start to create some sort of schedule so you're auditing whichever ones you have in here and rotating through them. All right, you must at least complete, one virtual restore. The first full, the master, the full is going to go back first to build the OS. You will notice that for a few minutes it goes into idle mode after it's done the first full restore. You can put it into audit mode at that point. But if you have, other incrementals, other application recovery points that it has to put back, it's going to hold those in the pending backups queue until you take it back out of audit mode again. All right. Once again, if you point the VFCs to the recovery series appliance, it supports automated audits. If you point it to Hyper-V, you can check a box for automated audits. Anything pointed to VMware, you have to manually audit these things. Create a schedule if you need to. Now, the automated audits is a little much. It does it every day. You get an email every day with a screenshot of your server booted up, letting you know, hey, this thing's booting. It's kind of cool, but it becomes a little bit much. All right, and once again, in VMware, after you finish auditing any VFC, you have to take it out of audit mode so that way all the restores in the future, they can keep going. Just like I described that earlier scenario where if you put it into audit mode right after the first full is restored, you'll see it booted up, but your applications, your updates won't be there, and it'll hold all those backups until you take it back out of audit mode. Then it'll resume those restores. All right, when we take a look at live mode for WinIR, right, this is right after your client fails. You go and poke it, check the live asset. It's down. It's truly down. You've rebooted it. You can't get it up. You're ready to fail over. You're going to go to your instant recovery area inside of the UI, inside of Satori, right? And you'll locate your asset that's already been created in there ahead of time, remember. If it doesn't exist, you can create it. It just takes time for Unitrends to go through the recovery process. Right? When you enable live mode, it shuts down that bare metal process. It modifies the configuration underneath on the VM side, right? Same thing with running on Unitrends. It modifies the configuration and tells the OS to boot instead of the ISO for rescuing it, keeping it up to date. It boots up into Windows. Now, you may have to set up any new required hardware pointing to it, anything through plug and play that it detects. It will detect a new NIC. It's going to DHCP by default. You have to change your public address, or your permanent address, right? Your static address. You're going to set it. And then make sure any applications work off that static address, right? Make sure it DNSs all that proper stuff. Right, once that new hardware is acquired, right, because you've got about 14 days until Unitrends starts to send you an email every day saying, hey, you've got a live mode instant recovery. You got to tear this thing down. Right, but hopefully within 24 hours, you get new hardware back. Once again, we went through the overview of putting the failback back over. You've got to perform that manual bare metal recovery from your latest recovery point and fail back over to your new hardware. Once you're back up and running on your new hardware, then you tear down the live mode running off the Unitrends appliance and then set it back up again. So that way the next time the new hardware fails again, you're ready to fail it over in live mode again. A few important notes about live recovery mode. The original assets backup and backup copy schedules protect the VFC in live mode. So if you go to live mode, we're going to continue to back it up and continue to replicate it just like it never moved. Any changes made to the VFC in live mode, they're captured under the identity of the original asset, just like it never moved once again. Ensuring that continuity of the recovery points for you. It is temporary. It immediately assumes the role of the original asset until you can recover it to the new hardware, as we already talked about. All right, now, but if you're going to a hypervisor, then it could be permanent. You just put it into live mode, do your changes on the hypervisor, make sure it's all running and good, and you tear it down on the Unitrends, but you'll notice that when you point them to the hypervisor, it prompts you and says, do you want to tear this down from the appliance and the hypervisor, or just the appliance? And in this case, you want to say just the appliance. You're going to leave it in live mode on the hypervisor, and you only want to tear it down from the appliance if you're going to go permanent to a hypervisor only. You can never go permanent to the Unitrends appliance. All right, once again, that appliance is going to start alerting you after 14 days. You're going to get alerts. A few recommendations if you're going live mode. If you're going, the live VFC as a temporary replacement, that failback is facilitated using that integrated bare metal recovery, that BMR. We're going to show you that process next once again too. Now, data from the live VFC is protected by the backup schedule. That doesn't change. Once again, it assumes the role of the original asset. Now, after you put the asset back to new hardware, right, you're going to recover backups from the VFC to the new Windows asset. So you're going to run recovery points against it. You're going to use those recovery points to recover into the new hardware. Once that's done, you're going to delete the VFC from the appliance and the hypervisor. Okay? Make sure you delete it from both. If you maybe went to, VMware or Hyper-V, now you've got new hardware, it's only running on Hyper-V or VMware temporarily, you're ready to go back to new hardware, you got it fixed, make sure you tear it down from both. Now, once again, if your VFC is going to go as a permanent replacement, you can only do this if you pointed them to VMware Hyper-V. But even if it's going permanent, we continue to protect it as if it never moved, just like the original asset. Right? Or you can disable those schedules and start to run Hyper-V or VMware snapshots or backups against it. Because now it is a virtual asset. And once you flip it into live mode, it shows up in your inventory sync, and you can start to run Hyper-V or VMware asset backups against it. Once again, once you're all done with this process, you want to make sure you delete the VFC from the appliance that it was managed on. Don't delete it from the hypervisor and the appliance. Make sure in this case you only do from the appliance. Once again, big warning down there for us. Make sure you delete it from the appliance only if you're going live mode and this thing is going to become permanent running on Hyper-V or VMware. When we look at this teardown process, when you delete a VFC, the appliance is going to immediately remove it from its list of the VFCs on your asset list in that area. But it can take several minutes for that appliance to, purge all the data and everything about it before it shows back up in the list for you to add again. All right, you got to wait for all this to happen before you can add it back in there sometimes. If you have not fully purged this asset out from the instant recovery area, the original asset, it won't come back into that list. You may have to contact support to see what happened there. In most cases it does, but sometimes it takes 5, 10, 15 minutes to fully tear down a machine and to be able to see it back in the list of assets to put back in a VFC. All right, let's take a look at bare metal recovery. Once again, this is the integrated bare metal recovery and how it works. Integrated bare metal recovery provides recovery of Windows and non-Windows assets. Once again, check that compatibility matrix to make sure you're looking at what we do offer, bare metals on. There are certain Linux operating systems, Solaris, right? Windows, of course. It does require a master file level backup. You have to at least have a master file level backup, and that master file level backup must contain all the critical disk data. Same thing as Windows Instant Recovery. If you're excluding the entire C drive or the boot volume, the system state, we can't instant recovery, we can't bare metal it either. You'll see that these processes are really similar. We use the same integrated bare metal boot ISO for Windows Instant Recovery. Right, the integrated bare metal recovery, it supports recovery to new hardware, dissimilar hardware. Right? We support driver injection for that dissimilar hardware restore. So if you're going to a new disk controller, right, you can inject that new disk controller before first boot. Everything else plug and play is going to be detected once Windows boots. The PCI, the chipsets, the buses, the bridges, NICs, display drivers. That's all detected on plug and play. Right? The integrated bare metal is awesome for P to V migrations and V to V migrations, going from VMware to Hyper-V or, Hyper-V to VMware, vice versa. Any kind of direction you need to go, these work great. We provide the drivers for VMware, Hyper-V, and Xen right on the integrated bare metal to inject to go to those three platforms by default, built into every ISO you boot off of. When we look at how bare metal works, we've already had a little skinny version of this, but you're going to run those scheduled backups. Right? These are file and folder level backups, and for 2003, you may have to run a hot image-based bare metal to do bare metal recovery for 2003 only. Right? We might talk about that a little bit later on too. All right? But now you've got these file level backups sitting on your local appliance or your replicated, right? or your hot target. You've got these scheduled backups sitting on your local backup appliance or your hot target. Right? You get new fixed server in here, right? Your server dies. You get new hardware. You fix your old hardware. You're ready to recover. You're going to boot off this ISO. I'm going to show you the ISO in the demo portion as well today. You're going to boot that OS up. You're going to point the machine, or you're going to point the operating system to the machine in the list, the latest recovery point, or whatever recovery point you want to use, and it's going to perform the integrated bare metal back to that new hardware. It lays down the operating system, all the changes, everything to that new hardware for you. All right, once that's done, you boot your server up, and you're all set. It replaces whatever asset that was lost, right? It could be, once again, the part of the instant recovery failback process, or it's just a kind of a pets or a cattle machine you lost, and you're just bringing it up while it's down offline, and you're going to bring it up from its latest recovery point. When we look at performing a bare metal recovery, the manual OS recovery process for Windows, you want to make sure you verify you have at least a current full against that agent-based asset once again. Running backups is so important. If we don't have the backup, you can't restore it. That backup, once again, must contain the OS boot volume and any critical disk metadata. Once again, you can restore from an incremental or differential file level backup. Doesn't have to be a full, any point in time, but you at least have to have a full, current, with the OS boot volume and critical metadisk data. Now you're going to upload that WinBM ISO from the virtual failover folder to a share. Right? Usually inside a VMware, data store or Hyper-V share, you'll burn it to a CD, you'll burn it to a thumb drive. You're going to set up your new hardware, and you're going to boot from that ISO, boot from that media. All right, the menu is pretty simple now. There's some buttons on the bottom. I'll show you them in the demo, but you're going to basically set the time zone so your points in time, your recovery points look right. You're going to verify your asset and your recovery point from step one once again. You're going to select them on the list. You go through and verify that you want to overwrite the drive, and you start the bare metal manual process. It does the restore on the back end for you. You have to wait for that process to finish, and then you're going to inject the similar drivers once it's done if you need to. If it's going VMware back to VMware, you don't have to. Hyper-V to Hyper-V, you don't have to. If you're going to different hardware, we give you the ability to inject new drivers for the new hardware. There are a few best practices for bare metal recovery. Once again, maintain agent-based backups of physical Windows servers. If you're not running backups against it, you're not keeping it up to date, you can lose data, lose OS changes. You may have to go back and run Windows updates, things like that. But at least make sure you're maintaining some sort of schedule against your physical assets. You also want to make sure you're keeping record and copies of critical disk controller drivers if you're using physical hardware for your critical servers. If you've got a domain controller running on certain Dell or HP hardware, know what disk controllers those physical servers are using. Get familiar with how disk controller drivers work. Keep records of which servers use which disk controller drivers. It's very important. We're not in the driver business. We can help you a little bit, but there's so many different drivers for so many different disk controllers. It really helps us if you know your homework. And once again, just like anything else, you want to audit and make sure you test your bare metal recovery process before you have a system failure. Make sure you're familiar with this process. Make sure you've gone through it once or twice so you understand how a bare metal works, the time involved. It's pretty cool, pretty simple, but just going through the process really helps when it comes time to a system failure, knowing what you're doing and keeping the sweat off your back. Next, let's watch the how-to video tutorial on setting up Windows Instant Recovery. And we're going to perform a Windows Instant Recovery, and we're going to take a look at an integrated bare metal recovery.